Before we begin, I want to say that as much as this talk stems from my deeply rooted love for wildness and wilderness, and I'm assuming you're all here because you love wilderness too, it won't be a pretty talk. Instead, it'll be about loss, despair, denial, and abject lack of honesty. Canadian naturalist John A. Livingston said our own faults are toughest to stomach, whether they come from innocence or deliberate intent. Regarding tonight's topics, I'm as at fault as anyone. But I think acknowledgement, or holding up a mirror, leads to forward thinking, which leads to solutions and a better future, which is the real point of this whole talk. To do this, I firmly believe that we need to integrate the wilderness conversation into the cultural conversation, and vice versa. Like Wendell Berry explained in The Unsettling of America, our ecological crisis is not a social or a political crisis, but a crisis of modern character. Which leads us to ask, what is the crisis of modern character? And since character is partly caused by, and to some degree inseparable from, culture, what exactly is the crisis of modern culture? Makes me think if most of our wilderness problems are also cultural problems, we have to face culture truthfully and head on to have an honest wilderness discussion. Let's begin by looking at the etymology of the word wild. You can trace it back in a lot of different directions, but for our purposes tonight, I think we can look to Thoreau's famous essay, Walking, from 1851, where he wrote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And what on earth did Thoreau mean by wildness there? Perhaps one answer is, in his fact book, he wrote wild, the past participle of to will, or self-will. The first line of the essay, Walking, he wrote, "I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness." Absolute freedom, absolute wildness. These are hardly the descriptions I'm used to hearing of nature. This is wild as self-determined, wild as autonomous, wild as free. Gary Snyder, in his 1990 book, The Practice of the Wild, put a spin on Thoreau's dictum and wrote, "Wildness is not just preservation of the world, it is the world." Snyder also went on to look in the Oxford English Dictionary and find that the OED defined anything to do with wild almost always in the negative, by the not. Of animals, not tame, undomesticated, unruly. Of plants, not cultivated. Of land, uninhabited, uncultivated. Of food crops, produced or yielded without cultivation, and so on. So Snyder then flip-flopped it, turned them into positives. Of animals, free agents, each with its own endowments, living within natural systems. Of plants, self-propagating, self-maintaining, flourishing in accord with innate qualities. Of land, a place where the original and potential vegetation and fauna are intact and in full interaction, and so on. I do want to ask, why is wildness problematic? Why the common misquote of Thoreau? And what I mean by that is, look almost anywhere and you see in wilderness is the preservation of the world. Not wildness, but wilderness. If you look on the internet, I did this the other day, you'll see, I found stationery, t-shirts, hats, everything under the sun with the quote wrong. It's sort of, I mean, this troubles me as an author to think of being dead and misquoted all over the place. But more importantly, it says, why the misquote? Why the common misuse of the word? One thing interesting within wilderness is the preservation of the world. If wilderness is a social construct we've come up with and it requires humanity's role in preserving the wilderness, then to say in wilderness is the preservation of the world implies that humans preserve the wilderness preserves the world, therefore humans preserve the world. And what's interesting, I think, about that misquote is that's 180 degrees opposite of what Thoreau meant, I think. Perhaps one problem with wildness being problematic is just simply it's an intangible. We can't measure or quantify it. And in a world of scientific fundamentalism, this is sort of problematic. But it doesn't bother us in other realms of the intangibles like honor, justice, love, faith, dreams. We have wild dreams. And if you think of the widespread and powerful value placed on the unquantifiable faith of religion, it's astounding. Interestingly, also, on a side note, we often quantify the unquantifiable emotions such as love or hate with unquantifiable nature. I love you more than all the stars in the heavens, all the trees in the forest, and so on. The reason I think this is important is perhaps it leaps to one of the core reasons why we value our experience of nature, which is it takes our subjective experience of this unquantifiable and it paradoxically enables us to experience the infinite, to experience the incalculable. So, while wildness may be problematic linguistically, it's undeniably everywhere, and I don't just mean in the woods. In town, there's moss, mold, yeast, fungus, pigeons, spiders, crickets, squirrels, bacteria. Even the human body, to some degree, is self-regulating, has a life of its own. Think of the autonomic nervous system. There's heart rate, digestion, respiratory rate, salivation, perspiration, pupillary dilation, micturition. The immune system. We do influence these things, often tremendously, but we also don't sit around willing our heart to beat. We don't sit around willing our immune system to work. They operate on their own. And I guess unlike the conventional connotations of wild as unruly and destructive, I've always seen a positive connotation of the word, much more in line with Thoreau's idea of wildness. And as soon as my daughter Harper was born, one of the very first things I did was memorize the piece of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. It's one of the most beautiful poems ever. And if you notice the title here is The Peace of Wild Things, not the war of wild things, not the unruly wild things, not the destruction of wild things. Following this line of thinking of wild as self-willed, autonomous, free, my wife and I also named our son Addison Wilder Holloway, because we believe that applies to humans too. We want him to have a free, a full, a meaningful life. All these things that I equate with the word wild. Jumping now to wilderness. If wildness is a quality, then wilderness is a place. And to quote Gary Snyder again, wilderness is a place where the wild potential is fully expressed, a diversity of living and non-living beings flourishing according to their own sorts of order. Now, of course, there are the definitions with negative connotations here, too. Wilderness is a wasteland. Wilderness is a negative sea of space or air. And a place in contrast to heaven, a place of danger and difficulty. All wilderness. And like I said earlier, let's talk also tonight about culture. When culture first appeared in the OED, about 1430, it meant cultivation, or tending the soil, based on the Latin culture. In the 19th century, culture became associated with refinement of the manners, refinement of the mind, the taste, sort of a higher culture. But then about the mid-20th century, its meaning shifted to, I think, a pretty agreeable working definition here from the American Heritage English Dictionary, which says the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought. From Cultural Anthropology by Daniel Bates and Fred Plogg, this is another, but similar definition, the system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of society use to cope with their world and with one another, and that are transmitted from generation to generation through learning. So a logical question here would be, okay, who or what is our culture then? And we'll address that here in 1 second. Because now what I want to talk about are two timelines. We've glanced at wildness, wilderness, culture. Let's see if we can begin to bring them together. The first timeline here comes from the novel The Story of Bee by Daniel Quinn, 1996. And it's a teaching in the back of the book that was given as a lecture called The Boiling Frog. The second timeline that I want to parallel with this is being the cultural, this being the wilderness, is what I'll just call the history of American wilderness, but principally coming from the book Wilderness in the American Mind by Dr. Roderick Nash, which originally came out in 1967. Before we begin to parallel these, I want to talk about the boiling frog for a little bit. First of all, the analogy in and of itself, and this is what Quinn talks about in The Story of Bee. The analogy is that if you take a pot of boiling water, you throw a frog into it, obviously it goes berserko and tries to get out as it's boiled to death. But interestingly enough, if you take a pot of tepid water, you put a frog in there, and you slowly turn the water up, over time the frog will interestingly become more and more placid, more and more tranquil, up until the point where right before the frog is boiled to death, it's actually the most tranquil, and then you can boil it to death. Some other analogies of this could be, well, one could be, take a young couple. They could spend themselves slowly, turning the water up slowly into catastrophic credit card debt over a period of time. Conversely, you have a young couple who has an unforeseen medical emergency, a car wreck or something. Well, they're suddenly thrown in the pot. They're thrown into the boiling water. Also credit card debt. Culturally, which is the reason Daniel Quinn brings this up, there are plenty of tribal and aboriginal cultures that were literally thrown in the pot of the dominant culture and don't exist anymore. There is also the example that Quinn gives of our culture, which is the frog in the pot that's being slowly boiled to death. So at this point, let's say, who is our culture? Let's ask, who is our culture? What is our culture? I'm going to follow Quinn's line of thinking here and say, back roughly 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic Revolution, that's where we began. The Neolithic Revolution, as you know, was an agricultural revolution. But agriculture had been around in the world for a long time and in different forms and all over the planet. However, about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent over in Mesopotamia, something different began to happen. Daniel Quinn calls this totalitarian agriculture, and linguistically and historically I'm going to stick with that because I think they're both appropriate. It's appropriate both ways. But what happened back then is we started overproducing food for the first time ever via agriculture. And all I mean by that is if you and your people needed, say, an acre for what you needed to live, well, suddenly you were producing 4 to 5 acres worth of food. You had surplus. Now, what's interesting about this and what's most important is the tie between food availability and population. And what I mean by this is population growth can only occur if there is a surplus of food. This can be proven in a lab, say with rats in a cage very easily because of their reproduction rates, and we'll use them as an analogy for a second. But once again, what I want to make clear here is this applies to every species on the planet. No species is exempt from this. But if we go back to the mice in the lab for 1 second, say you have 50 mice in your cage, and you feed them for 50 mice, they'll hover right around 50 mice. But say you suddenly feed them for 100. Their population will jump to 100. Once again, say 90 to 110, somewhere in there. Say you then feed them for 300. Interestingly enough, pretty quickly, because they're mice, they'll jump up to 300, and they'll hover around 300, give or take a few. You can drop it back down to enough food for roughly 200 mice, the population will go down, it'll hover around 200 mice again. This applies to all species, humans included. Now, what's important for us to think about in relation to this is simply that we can't eat cardboard, we can't eat engines. We had to produce surplus of food for our population to grow. And our population is still growing. This population boom that began in the Neolithic Revolution roughly 10,000 years ago is still happening today, and we'll chronicle that in 1 second with these timelines. But what's important is the direct relation between food and population. Another way you could think about this actually is biomass. The world as a whole has about the same biomass at most points in time. It does vary over big long periods of time, but not in shorter periods of time. And so when the earth is converted into human food, that biomass is simply converted. Think about when we came and cleared the Great Plains, heading west. The biomass that was there in the form of wildlife, wild plants, wild animals, and so on, the natural world, as we converted that into human food, and mind you, into human mass, there was no gain or loss of biomass there. It was simply a conversion of biomass. What's really weird to think about, but very interesting, is that if that was literally converted into human food, which was converted into human mass, if you follow that line of thinking with species that went extinct, they were literally converted into human mass. That's a strange thought. This seems to have an obvious end result, which is a world jam-packed full of humans. But, you know, I do ask seriously if our culture, economy, values, all these things are based on growth, exponential growth. Growth, by definition, doesn't seem to me to be very sustainable. It seems like most of these are really short-term questions. Another thing to think about in relation to this idea of biomass, with this idea of population and food availability, is carrying capacity. I'm going to define carrying capacity here as the number of creatures living in a certain way that can be sort of supported permanently on a certain piece of land. You always hear the deer on the island analogy. So how many deer can live on an island without overgrazing or damaging the capacity for that island to grow food for them? Now, permanently is the key word here. Consider cities. I just went over to Seattle recently and stood inside the city of Seattle on a sidewalk and thought how much of the resources that are in the city being consumed right now come from this land base versus how many are imported into this city. And it, you know, other than some rooftop gardens, it's a ridiculous ratio of imported goods. So what I'm saying is cities must import resources. That is sort of the way we can, I think you can define cities by that. Therefore, they're unsustainable. You use up what's in your little land base here as your city grows. Well, you hop over to the next ridge, you hop over to the next watershed, and you get their resources so that you can continue to live and grow. This was originally called conquest, colonialism. Now we call it the global economy. But I think we really need to consider this idea of carrying capacity in relation to oil. And we can't avoid this topic. Oil is absolutely and completely woven into every bit of our lives. Our economy, our food production, transportation, everything. Look around your kitchen, look around any place at any point in time in our civilized world, oil is there. And I don't just mean automobiles here. Obviously the production of automobiles ends up being almost the worst part of it, but what I mean is every little thing has petrochemical plastics. Think of the fact that we use petrochemicals to produce fertilizers, to produce food. The food is then wrapped in petrochemical plastics that are then packaged in factories and then shipped on, via machines using petroleum that are built by other petroleum machines ad infinitum. This goes on and on forever, and it's not just the gas we put in our cars. It's absolutely every little bit of our lives. What's the problem, I guess, here? Well, oil's going to run out. At the present rate of consumption, oil will run out. I used to work in oil fields right after college, and there's what they call the Hubbert curve, which is just a bell curve to describe the life of an oil field. Well, you start out wildcatting, and you start finding oil, you start hitting, then production really takes off. You end up reaching peak production, you're drilling all over the place, you're nailing it. And then beyond that, as the bell curve tapers, oil is harder to find, there's less of it, until finally you call the field dry. Everything I can find from from petroleum geologists say, from a global standpoint, we are past peak production right now. And yet our consumption every year still continues to go up. So the problem is, the oil's going to run out. And as I said before, it's absolutely a part of every little aspect of our lives. And the last I heard, without full-scale dependence on fossil fuels like we seem to be doing now, we would need about 10 Earths to hold the population of people as is. And remember, the deer on the island, remember carrying capacity. One thing interesting, if you think of, just to put a spin on the language of it, Derek Jensen, in this book, Endgame, where a lot of these ideas come from, he changes the language from overpopulation to overconsumption. Now, the immediate problem with this is that it destroys the fundamentals of our capitalist economy. But, in all seriousness, the U.S. uses less than 5%, or we are less than 5% of the world's population, yet we use more than a quarter of the world's resources and produce a quarter of the world's pollution and waste. The book was written in 2006, and it said then that the average U.S. citizen to the average Indian citizen used 50 times more steel, 56 times more energy, 170 times more synthetic rubber, 250 times more motor fuel, and 300 times more plastic. Yet the images we see are of quote-unquote overpopulation, certainly not overconsumption. And now, we can begin our timelines. We'll pause here. So our dual timelines, and I'm going to quote and paraphrase from Daniel Quinn as we go. We'll start with the Neolithic Revolution every time I hit the button here and pop up, something else pops up, it's going to double the population of the planet. So we're going to jump to 3,000 before Common Era, and we're now at 50 million people, and I should say every time beyond this that I hit it, it'll double. So 50 million people, believe it or not, the Earth was for the first time crowded. The fertile land, the land that was good for livestock and good for crops, was actually becoming less and less productive. It was overworked, overgrazed. What ended up happening for the first time ever in the history of the planet, there were too many people competing for too few resources. The resources were beginning to dwindle. And remember, cities must import resources. So it's during this time period that we see the monarch's sword of power, massive standing armies forged. There are no scientists, no historians, no philosophers, no prophets, no conquerors. Important people are the people with armies. And the military needs drove technology at this point in time. All the technological advancements were made for the interest of the military. Nobody thought there was anything wrong with this. This was all an improvement. What did this mean for wilderness back then? Civilization was just being carved out of the wilderness. Everything depended on rising out of that wilderness situation. So I'll hit it here. Let's double our population from 50 million people to 100 million people. And we're going to do this in 1,600 years. At this point, there are 100 million humans. About 90% are the dominant culture. And this is the Bronze Age. Big wars, real weapons, real armor, vast standing armies. Also slums, slave trade, corruption begins to emerge. Crime begins to emerge as a problem. And what's interesting here is crime's not universal among humans. Misbehavior is, unpleasant behavior is, disruptive behavior is. But crime requires a state. It requires laws, and it requires enforcement. Interestingly enough, the same time we see crime emerge is at the dawn of literacy. As soon as people started to write, they started writing laws. Writing them enabled to do something they had never done before, which was define in exact terms, exact fixed terms, the behaviors they wanted the state to regulate, punish, and suppress. Let's double our population again. This time we're going to go up to BC, birth of Christ, 200 million people, 95% the dominant culture. At this point, you have a lot of there's civil revolt, assassination, counterfeiting, catastrophic inflation. Famine becomes a regular feature all over the world, as did plague, symptomatic of overcrowding, poor sanitation. Slavery became a huge business. It still is down to the present moment. But what's interesting about this time to me is, for the first time ever that we know of in the history of humanity, people began to question if something wasn't fundamentally wrong. If there wasn't something missing inside, something that money and status couldn't fill, perhaps. There was a void. Something was innately wrong. At this same time, Judaism, Brahmanism, Hinduism, Shintoism, Buddhism all came into being. And what's important to note here is they had no existence before this. So I'm going to call these the salvation religions. Bring us to 1200 Common Era, 1200 AD. There's 400 million people now. About 98% is the dominant culture. These salvation religions are doing well. The masses, everyone, nothing matters but you and your salvation. Forget the pain. Forget the boiling. Wilderness, what I find is interesting, if you look at the Old Testament, wilderness, the word occurs 245 times. It's almost always an arid wasteland, or a place of negative space. Take Deuteronomy 8:15. It says, the quote-unquote great and terrible wilderness was almost always, quote, thirsty ground where there was no water. I bring this up because the majority of all of the wilderness references in the Bible were places of they were arid lands. They were places where cattle, livestock, and crops could not grow. What is absolutely fascinating to me, though, also about the Old Testament, is that Moses received the Ten Commandments on top of Mount Sinai, deep in the heart of the wilderness. The wilderness was actually a place to get closer to God. And if you looked at the Israelites' 40-year wandering, they used wilderness as a refuge from an oppressive society, Egypt. Edward Abbey talked about the same thing in the 70s and 80s. Double the population again. We're at 800 million people. This is 1700 AD, the Common Era. About 99% is the dominant culture. This is the age of the bubonic plague, the first known madhouse, the first debtor's prison opened in London. Pope Paul III walls Jews off from the rest of Rome, creating the first ghetto. Millions die from famines, syphilis, typhus, ergotism, sweating sickness, smallpox, diphtheria. The slave trade flourishes as Africans are transported all over the New World. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes described the life of man as quote-unquote solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A few years later, Blaise Pascal noted that, quote-unquote, all men naturally hate one another. This period ends in decades of economic chaos, revolts, famines, epidemics. And let me make something crystal clear here. These are not signs of human evil. These are reactions to overcrowding. Too many people competing for too few resources. Eating rotten food, drinking foul water, watching their families starve, watching their families fall to the plague. In only 200 years now, we double the world's population. We're at 1900 AD. This is about 99.5% the dominant culture, 1.5 billion humans. The quality of life becomes so questionable at this point, religious prophets are actually attracting followers just by predicting the imminent end of the world. The opium trade becomes a huge international business. The East India Company sponsors British warships. Australia, New Guinea, India, Africa, they're all carved up as colonies by the major powers of Europe. Indigenous people from all over the world are wiped out by millions by diseases brought to them by the Europeans. Measles, pellagra, whooping cough, smallpox, cholera. Europeans also, there were 60 million Europeans that died of smallpox in the 18th century alone. Tens of millions died of cholera as well. So the Europeans were suffering from epidemics as well. And anyone who doubts the integral connection here between agriculture and famine, you need only examine the crop record of this period. It's crop failure, famine, crop failure, famine, crop failure, famine, crop failure, famine. All over the civilized world, and the numbers are staggering. 10 million starved to death in Bengal, 1769. 2 million in Ireland and Russia, 1845 and 46. Nearly 15 million in China and India from 1876 to 1879. France, Germany, Italy, Britain, Japan. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands died in famines. Cities became more crowded. Human anguish reached highs that was unimaginable before. You just had slums of unconceivable squalor, disease born of rats, contaminated water, and there was no education, no means of betterment here for the majority of these people. So crime flourished, mental illness flourished, economic instability marked this period of the French Revolution. There is the Industrial Revolution. Great, that just brought exploitation of women and children. There were tons of uprisings, sensibly, and tons of people died in those uprisings. Millions of people died in those. What does this mean for wilderness? 1700 to 1900. The wolf and the wild boar were deliberately exterminated from Europe during this period. The great Aukaveli Island near Iceland was hunted to extinction for its feathers in 1844, which was the first species we know to be wiped out for commercial reasons. In North America, to facilitate railway construction, undermine the food base of the natives, hunters destroyed bison herds, as many as 3 million in a single year. About 1,000 were left by 1893. So wilderness, from the Puritan and the pioneer mindset, was still very much a manifest destiny mindset. We must make this paradise out of wilderness into a rich, prosperous civilization. This is Genesis 1:28. The biblical justification is prominent during this time. It drives it. Think of the Georgia governor, George R. Gilmer, had a great quote where he said, quote, by virtue of that command of the Creator, delivered to man upon his formation, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, end quote. That was exemplary of that time. Military metaphors also accompanied this mindset. If you look at any of the writings of this time period, wilderness was a quote-unquote enemy that had to be conquered, vanquished. There was this struggle with nature. Interestingly enough, though, America at the same time was trying, we were a new country, and we were trying to create our own culture. We needed a distinct culture. There was no wilderness counterpart in the old world. We quickly realized wilderness was an American asset, of all things. it ended up serving our identity. By the mid-1800s, it was a basis for our national self-esteem, actually. During the same time period, I should point out, you had the Romantics, you had Kant, and those folks that were really the first to see nature as something of the sublime, something sort of, I would call it a highbrow aesthetics. It was more than just a simple utility of the normal way of seeing nature at that point in time. If you look at also the transcendentalists, the highbrow aesthetics around Harvard, such as Fuller, Thoreau, Emerson, they were the first in our neck of the woods to really see the wild in a new sense. But it was still a vehicle to the spiritual. It still served our highest moral needs. It still was, to some degree, a utility. March 1st, 1872, Ulysses S. Grant, president, declared over 2 million acres Yellowstone National Park. In 1885, the state of New York created the 715,000 acre forest preserve in the Adirondacks. But we're doubling. In only 60 years now, 1960 Common Era, we're at 3 billion people. Less than 2% are the non-dominant culture. We've had a global economic collapse now, 2 cataclysmic world wars. 65 million people died on battlefields, another 100 million escaped. As far as wilderness goes, the frontier is dead. But we need to keep our cultural images new. This was a predicament. Interestingly, at this point in time, from 1900 to 1960, the wilderness argument, or the wilderness thought shifted. The argument became that we needed places to escape from civilization to. What's interesting to me about this point in time is no one questioned civilization during it, but they certainly said we needed a place to run to. The first half of the 1900s, the Bible was the best-selling book in America, but the Boy Scouts Handbook was second best-selling. The Boy Scouts exploded at the beginning of the 1900s. To quote from the intro to their handbook, it said that we needed to escape from our quote-unquote degeneracy, from quote that we were quote strained and broken by the grind of the overbusy world, end quote. This same time period, after the 1906 fire and earthquake in San Francisco, the legislation that allowed the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir and Dam to be put in Yosemite in 1913 wasn't that surprising. But John Muir and a handful of people put up a heck of a fight against that reservoir. That was surprising to the world. And that was what really marked our present-day environmental movement's beginnings, in the sense of a legislative battle that created nationwide attention. The beginning of the 1900s also brought Robert Marshall, Sigurd Olson, Howard Zanziger wrote the first draft of the Wilderness Act, David Brower, and then the Echo Park Dam victory of 1956. That was huge. That was the victory we've been waiting on. But, as I said, we're doubling. 1960 to 96, only 36 years this time, and we're at 6 billion people. All but a tiny fraction of the dominant culture. War, crime, corruption, slavery, revolt, famine, plague, drugs. I want to point out that these all appeared first as a social fixture, but then they became a way of life. To quote Jack Turner from The Abstract Wild, and we'll get into this book in depth in a moment, he says, "We accept a diminished world as normal. We accept a diminished way of life as normal. We accept diminished human beings as normal. What once was considered pathological becomes statistically common. And eventually, quote-unquote, normal. A move that often veils denial." So, wilderness, from 60 to 96, following the momentum of the Echo Park victory, there was the 1964 Wilderness Act, which was huge. But there was the loss of the Grand Canyon dam battles in the 60s. Interestingly enough, in 68, there was the Wild and Scenic River Act. But not 1 inch of the Colorado was included, and I guess that's not surprising. The general attitude of wilderness during this time period shifted again also, in that it was thought of as a place for our not only our mental health, but also reservoirs of human freedom. Civilization was no longer a place of freedom to us. One of my favorite quotes that exemplifies this is, I think it was in San Francisco, but a young kid has a backpack on. Someone says, "Why do you backpack?" And he says, "To get the hell out of here," pointing at the city. That was indicative of this time period. This brings us to the present day. And the present day recreation boom that has been going strong since the 1970s. Essentially, we're loving wilderness to death. And how do you handle so many two-leggeds? There's quota systems, permit systems. These seem to be at the heart of most management efforts today on our public lands. But, you know, and I do think these are done with the best intentions. But I'll quote from Roderick Nash now, in Wilderness in the American Mind, where he says, quote, "Still, the idea of intense control that quota systems entail is difficult to square with the meaning of wilderness. Essentially, a man-managed wilderness is a contradiction, because wilderness necessitates an absence of civilization's ordering influence. The quality of freedom so frequently associated with wilderness is diminished, if not destroyed, by regulation." I do wonder sometimes about this idea in relation to impact and maybe not so much numbers, just like Jensen talked about overpopulation and overconsumption, if you change the language a little bit. Hundreds of me can do what I like to do, which is walk off trail. They could cruise through fragile alpine meadows. We could camp. We could spend lots of time. And honestly, a day or so later, you wouldn't even know we were there. As much as I like riding stock, it's not the same. So I don't know. Maybe that could lead to a different way of looking at this from not just a sense of numbers. But anyway, the summary here to do with culture and wilderness is this. Culture says multiply, conquer, divide, subdue, exploit. And wilderness is really just this negative wasteland or a utility. Either way, we need to use it. We need to exploit it. We need to manipulate it. So present day culture, it's not really hard to see what's coming. You can get on the internet and there's millions of articles, not millions, but there's tons of articles from tons of reputable writers for tons of reputable magazines and newspapers that talk about global economic collapse. It talks about a resource squeeze. It talks about economic instabilities, population increases. These things are easy to find, and that's not what I want to talk about. I'd rather direct our conversation now to wilderness and stay there for the rest of the night. So, right now what I want to do is a wilderness status check. And if you spend any time on a radio, in case you work in the backcountry of the park, you would do a status check. What does that mean? That just means, how are you? What's the status? So, what's critical for tonight's conversation is this. If wildness is a quality, wilderness is a place, then we can logically ask, how wild is our wilderness? We can also ask, how wild is the Bob Marshall wilderness? And at first glance, if we do apply Thoreau's notion of self-willed wildness, autonomous, free, and if you look at our 1964 Wilderness Act, wilderness, it doesn't appear very wild. A good breakdown of this actually comes from The Abstract Wild by Jack Turner, and I'm going to paraphrase and quote from him for a little bit now as we go. So, how wild is our wilderness? Not very. Reason number one is too small. About a third of the wilderness areas are smaller than 10,000 acres, which is about 4 miles a side. Some are smaller than 100 acres. These are often islands. Only 4% are larger than 500,000 acres, 27 miles a side. Think about around here, all the elongated mountain ranges and the wilderness areas. There's the Cabinets, the Missions, there's the Flathead Range right over here, and the Great Bear, there's the Anaconda and Pentlers. All of those ranges I can hike back, over and back across in a single day. So, you know, Aldo Leopold defined a wilderness area as a place where you could do a 2-week pack trip. Is this even possible still in the lower 48? I don't know. To quote from Jack Turner here, the law is simple. The farther you are from a road and the longer you are out, the wilder your experience. 2 weeks is the minimum. A month is better. Until then, the mind remains saturated with human concerns and blind to the natural world. The body bound to metronomic time and ignorant to natural biological rhythms. A traveler in small wilderness for a weekend backpack trip remains ignorant of these differences between short and long stays in the wilderness. And I would add that being alone is critical here as well. I mean, I've hiked 18 days across the Bob with my best friend, for instance, and we only saw a few parties of people the whole time. And I've done, you know, trips, like I just 2 summers ago did a 16-day trip by myself. And within 4 or 5 days alone, you're much more in tune with your surroundings, and you have much more of a, I don't know, transcendence, for lack of a better word, than I did, say, in the entire 18 days with my best friend. Now, granted, he's a ton of fun, and he's really funny. He keeps you occupied, but being alone, I think, is absolutely critical. And you know, how does the Bob fare in all this? Since the Bob is one thing we're talking about tonight, the Bob does really well with size. It's 1.5 million acres. That's huge by 64 Wilderness Act standards in general. It's a good bit of room. Second reason from Turner is too few predators. And what's important here is that predators are perhaps our most direct and accessible experience of the wild. And this is not probably the best pictures, but this picture here is a shot of a grizzly bear up in the back of a basin up in the Flathead Range on opening day of rifle season several years ago now. These are fresh wolf prints at about 4 something in the morning, coming off climbing St. Nick, coming out Coal Creek in the park. We'd obviously just spooked this wolf just ahead of us coming out there. But the point here is, when you see even a fresh grizzly track, and not even the animal itself, something changes. It's instinctual, it's visceral. Your body language, your body chemistry, your attention, your emotions. My focus changes dramatically when I know a big bear is around. And so how does the Bob do here? It does great. You know, we have lots of big predators. Next, Turner says it's too controlled. And remember, this would be opposite of Thoreau's self-willed definition of wildness. And quoting from Turner here, he says, "Intensive recreational use influences public policy, leading those with authority to institute artificial methods of control that benefit recreational use. Animal populations are managed by control hunting. Wildfires are suppressed, predators moved, and humans treated in a manner best described by the word surveillance. The wild becomes a problem to be solved by further human intervention. Scientific studies, state and federal laws, judicial decision, political compromise, and administrative and bureaucratic procedures. Once this intervention begins, it never ends. It spirals into further and further human intrusion, rendering wilderness increasingly evaluated, managed, regulated, and controlled. That is, tamed. Nibble by nibble, decision by decision, animal by animal, fire by fire, we have diminished the wildness of our wilderness." Now the Bob does so here as well, because there's a balance of management and then the autonomy of the natural systems. We let some fires burn, we don't others. But if you look at the whole 1964 Wilderness Act, the Bob does pretty well with all of these. The rest doesn't do so well. Is any of this surprising? It really shouldn't be. If you look at the Wilderness Act itself, it says, "To secure an enduring resource of wilderness, devoted to the public purposes of recreation, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historical use." To quote Turner, "These environments are not wild. They are too known, designed, administered, managed, and controlled to be wild." If you do think of these next to the Amazon, the Yukon, the Himalayas, as Turner points out, they don't seem to be too wild. I guess I would add here that the Wilderness Act itself seems to me to be the real problem. What starts out as one of the most beautiful pieces of legislation ever really fizzles out and falls downhill. What I mean is, Section 4D, special provisions, basically negates everything that Section 4C says. Let me show you this. This is from the Wilderness Act. I bolded these and italicized them. It wouldn't look that way on the Act, but I only did that so we could just point out what's important here. And these are the prohibitions of certain uses. So no commercial enterprise, no permanent road, no temporary road, no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, no other form of mechanical transport, and no structure or installation within any such area. So that's what the Wilderness Act says, Section 4C. Now, Section 4D, special provisions. I purposely left this on the slide like this to show you how much more room it takes up in the Act. And I'll squint here, and once again I'm only going to read what I bolded. The act wouldn't be bolded. So this says, the special provisions, we can actually use aircraft or motorboats for the control of fire, insects, and diseases. Prospecting for the purpose of gathering information about mineral or other resources. Let's see, mineral leases. With the use of land for mineral location and development and exploration, drilling and production, and the use of land for transmission lines, water lines, telephone lines, or facilities necessary in exploring, drilling, producing, mining, and processing operations, including, where essential, the use of mechanized ground or air equipment and restoration. Together with the right to cut and use so much of the mature timber therefrom as may be needed in the extraction, removal, and beneficiation of the mineral deposits. Water resources, grazing, don't forget grazing. Authorize prospecting for water resources, the establishment and maintenance of reservoirs, water conservation works, power projects, transmission lines, and other facilities needed in the public interest, including the road construction and maintenance, essential to development and use thereof. The grazing of livestock. Commercial services may be performed within the wilderness areas designated by this act. So, special provisions, section 4D. There's little wonder why you thought these places would remain wild at all. And I guess the special provisions thing to me just doesn't make any sense because it does negate the first half of the act. And if you think for a moment of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Thank God there was no special provisions in that that said we have to treat certain people certain ways under certain conditions. That would be ridiculous. And most importantly, it would have undermined the entire act. So, you know, people tout the Wilderness Act as this great bipartisan victory. Well, no wonder it was a bipartisan victory. Both sides got what they wanted. I think of John Locke when he said, the reason of a rule ceases. When the reason of a rule ceases, so should the rule. Maybe we should think about the Wilderness Act in relation to that. In the book that I'm working on right now, I actually rewrite the Wilderness Act. Maybe that's a place to start. I'm not sure. But I think when the second half undermines the first half, we should consider it more.